In these couple of lectures, we're going to talk about uh, sensory systems as well as higher order cognitive system with an example of spatial navigation system. So in the previous lecture, we saw the visual system, how information processed from the retina in the eye to the lateral geniculate nucleus of the thalamus and to the visual system, and we saw how the information gets transformed, how you can use a variety of uh, tools to uh, fix problems with the visual system, as well as we saw the applications of what we learned from this human visual system to uh, to make artificial devices that solve the visual problem. Similar kind of things will be discussed about the auditory system, the somatosensory system, and the olfactory system that deals with smell. So when we look at it, there are some similarities and differences, right? So for example, at the periphery, you have to have sensors. Yeah. So for auditory system, you have the cochlea within the inner ears, which senses the sound stimulus. There are receptors on the skin that sense touch, pain, heat, cold, and so on. You have your tongue that can taste as well as actually has touch receptors. In the olfactory system that's responds to smells. In the nose, you have the olfactory receptor neurons in the olfactory epithelium that encode smell-related information, right? So this information now has to pass on to the brain. Some of these brain regions now have intermediate locations. So, for example, in the brain stem, you have cochlear nucleus and inferior colliculus that lie in between the cochlea and the thalamus before the information goes to the cortex. Whereas for touch, you have to have pass the information uh, through the spinal cord in your back before this information goes to the thalamus and then the cortex. Uh, uh, for the olfactory system, you have a completely different region called the olfactory bulb, which is not really equivalent of any of these regions. And then finally, that information passes through the piriform cortex. And at these different stages of information gets processed, right? Remember that in case of visual cortex, there were like dozens of different areas within the cortex. Other sensory modalities are not as complexly evolved. They have way fewer regions that process information related to those sensory modalities. And then finally, information from all these sensory modalities comes together in order to create this complex percept of the world. We will see towards the end of this talk, we'll see how uh, your visual sensory modality affects what you hear and so on. So these different sensory modalities end up affecting each other. So in order to solve your higher order cognitive task, you need to take inputs from all kinds of sensory modalities that are available to you, process your information that is available to you within your system, and then put it together in order to solve higher order cognitive problems, right? So in case of navigation, knowing where you are, going from where you are to where you want to be, planning your route, and so on. So we'll see correlates of that at the very end of this lecture. All right. So let's start with the kind of problems that the somatosensory system has evolved to solve, right? So now we're going to watch a video of a moth flying around looking for honey, right? And moths, as you know, have these little proboscis, literally long straws that are wound around at the tip of their face that can be extended using hydraulics and then inserted into the flowers to suck up nectar from those. So now let's look at it. So this moth is flying around. You see this rolled up proboscis. It slowly starts getting extended as the moth approaches the flower. This is all hydraulics. Moth pressurizes the proboscis, proboscis opens up, and then finally moth manages to localize where the hole for the nectar is in the flower, and pushes the proboscis in, right? So this whole process now is quite uh, has to be guided quite precisely. Remember that flowers are moving around. This video was shot at night because many of these moths are nocturnal. So there's no light available to the moth. Here, this was shot in infrared light so that the moth couldn't see what was going on. And uh, and the moth was using smell to find a flower. Once it got to the flower, it was using that sense of touch to figure it out. So here is we'll look at the next video that should make clear the kind of strategies. So now this video has been shot in a lab using an artificial flower. So you can define the size of the flower, the shape of the flower, the curvature, and then finally where the nectar repository is, and so on, right? So you can see the kind of strategies that this moth is going to follow in order to find nectar. So, so as you can see, the moth first figures out the shape of this uh, flower by touching, and it figures out that there is a depression in the middle, which is most likely the location where it will find nectar. And once it's found that, it it pushes its proboscis in and then starts drinking, right? And this problem is quite complex. You remember that moth is constantly hovering around in the air in order to find the flower. Once it finds the flower, it's still hovering around while its proboscis moves around the surface of the flower to figure out its curvature and shape, to finally figure out where the hole is and get it. So if you look at the radial position is going up and down, so going farther away, then coming closer, farther away, coming closer, till finally the moth figures out here is where it is, and it finally settles down to drink the nectar. Right? So, so your motor system now needs to get instructions from your somatosensory system to coordinate. So moths are not the only creatures that do this kind of uh, sensory motor kind of coordination. Uh, uh, you have to solve these problems in real world, right? So for example, if I have to pick up these two pencils, I can pick this up, I can pick this pencil up individually, I can pick them both up together, I can use them like chopsticks and move them in a very, very nuanced kind of fashion. So you can do very, very complex kind of movements and using the motor system as well as somatosensory system that is instructing the motor system as to how far you're moving, how fast you're moving, how tightly am I grabbing this pencil, and so on, right? Um if, for example, I am grabbing this box of tissues, now if I grab it lightly, I can hold it properly. But if I apply uh, uh, too much pressure, I can sort of start crumbling this box. And then the box can slip out of my hand, the box will get damaged, and you can see all kinds of problems arising if you do these kinds of things, right? So you need to be very dexterous and careful, and you always need feedback from your somatosensory system in order to guide your motor system. So obviously, when you design robots, your robots also need to solve those kinds of problems. So here we are going to watch a promotional video of a robotics company that talks about how they're using sensory feedbacks so that we can actually see a real world application in action.
Sanctuary AI has successfully integrated the new tactile sensor technology into its Phoenix general-purpose robots. The integration came as the company recently unveiled Sanctuary AI's cutting-edge tactile sensors and demonstrated progress in creating dexterous intelligence for autonomous labor. The sense of touch is a key enabler for creating human-level dexterity in robots and critical for physical AI to achieve its full potential. The tactile sensors enable reliable and confident fine manipulation when vision is occluded, unlocking capabilities such as blind picking, slippage detection, and prevention of excessive force application, all broadening the scope and range of tasks for general-purpose robots. By equipping these advanced touch sensors, it provides industry-leading capabilities to perform an expanded set of work tasks. The improvements in new tactile sensors enable general-purpose robots to perform complex, touch-driven tasks with precision and accuracy. The behavioral data collected from new tactile sensors allows embodied physical AI models to be more robust and performant. Without tactile sensing, robots depend on video to interact with their environment. With video alone, you don't know you've touched something until well after the collision has physically caused the object to move. This reduces work efficiency and can require numerous attempts, grasping and regrasping the same object for a secure hold, so touch solves this. The company claims that as global labor shortages continue to impact industries, many organizations are struggling to fill roles that sustain their operations. Sanctuary AI's proprietary technology is focused on addressing these growing labor challenges by developing world-leading dexterous hand technology that enables general-purpose robots to fill gaps in the global workforce, fulfilling jobs across a variety of industries, including automotive, distribution, energy, logistics, retail, telecom, utilities, and more. The company, in 2024, unveiled the latest iteration of its Phoenix robots, now equipped with advanced tactile sensors, and remains committed to driving innovation in the AI and robotics industry. This integration marks a further milestone in differentiating its approach to dexterity from competitors who rely on stereo camera feeds for their technology to interact with objects in the real world. The company has been recognized as an intellectual property leader across categories related to general-purpose robots and embodied AI.
All right, so I hope you noticed in the video how the sensors on individual fingertips, right? So this robot only had touch sensors on the fingertips, and those sensors could figure out how much pressure was being applied and at exactly which point. So that feedback can be used for how tightly the robot grabs and so on, and then dexterous movements and all those things. So uh, obviously the robot has to have much more sensory inputs than these touch sensors that they were talking about, but they're discussing that only specifically in the context of adding these touch sensors to phenomenally increase the capabilities of the robot. All right, so So now if we start looking at um, uh, information processing in the brain, and how can you use this in order to control motor actions, right? So here is an experiment that was done by Miguel Nicolelis's lab with monkeys, right? So they were recording from a number of sensory as well as motor regions in the brain while the monkey was taught to perform a visually guided task. So here the monkey is sitting in a monkey chair. It has access to a joystick-like pole that the monkey is supposed to manipulate in order to change some displays on the monitor. As the information, as the monkey does the task, the neural data gets saved to a computer, and it actually gets used. It gets analyzed online as the animal is performing the task, and that gets used for controlling a robotic arm that is trying to solve a similar task that the monkey is trying to solve visually. You can train the monkey to actually now start using this robotic arm using this task. And once the monkey finally figures out the task, they actually disconnect the actual control from the joystick that goes to both the screen as well as to the robotic arm, and instead start using the activity of the neurons and as their neural networks analyze that information to predict what movements the animal is trying to do. And then, just by looking at the activity of the brain, they're able to solve the task both on the screen as well as using this robotic arm. And finally, the monkey itself figures out that the joystick no longer works, and yet the activity in the brain continues while the monkey stops using the joystick, and monkey basically just starts imagining performing those actions happen on the screen as well as on the robotic arm, and the task gets done, right? So here is a simple task that the monkey is taught to do. First, the monkey is taught to move the joystick in order to move the 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 yellow object to reach in the inside of the green object. Once the animal learns to do that, the monkey is then taught to do a gripping task. So hold the grip tightly, but only up to a point such that your yellow circle expands to be in between these two red circles. So basically, the idea is that as the monkey grips, there is a sensor in the pole that measures the pressure applied by the monkey to hold that grip, and and that pressure is displayed as the diameter of this yellow circle, sorry, and that yellow circle keeps getting bigger and bigger, and the monkey has to control that grip such that it will apply the exactly right amount of pressure so that that yellow circle falls in between these two lines. If it expands beyond, monkey does not get a reward. If it remains exactly at the same position, monkey gets a reward. So this is an equivalent of reach and grab kind of a task, right? Uh, so then finally you combine the two. You get the monkey to move the yellow circle to the green circle, and once it reaches the green circle, you get the monkey to expand the yellow circle by grasping tightly onto the pole, but only applying certain amount of pressure. So when you do that, you see that both you first, when the monkey learns to do this task, the pole control shows these kind of movements, right? Your pole is moving in certain way. Uh, when that happens, you can see that uh, a variety of different different muscle groups are working, right? Wrist flexors are working, wrist extenders are working, biceps are working to move uh, move the joystick back and forth, right? And then uh, and then finally to grab the thing. Once the monkey, however, figures this task out, as I was telling you earlier, the experimenters simply disconnect the control from the joystick to the monitor or to the robotic arm, and then simply let the monkey perform that task, uh, simply by using the activity of the neurons in the brain. So they have trained the neural network, artificial neural network, on the activity of the neurons, and then now they're simply using that to complete the loop, right? The monkey is performing monkey thinks it's performing the task by moving the joystick, but actually monkey is performing the task by creating certain activity in its brain that gets interpreted by this neural network as doing moving and then grasping task, right? And then finally monkey literally just figures out that, yep, you know what, I need to move that arm any longer. And sure enough, you see that the muscle activity completely dies down, but at the same time you see the movements, right? Movements of both the dot on the screen as well as the robotic arm. Those happen, but those happen with the brain control, and you 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 get recovery to full performance. Now if your monkeys can do these kinds of tasks, you are going to be able to now solve these problems in the real world, right? So you can create uh, a system that aids a human who has had a spinal cord damage or some limb injury that prevents the human from doing these kinds of motion. Now you can attach artificial limbs or augment the limbs of the human in order to solve those problems, right? uh, you can use activity of uh, neurons in your brain in order to guide those kinds of movements. So here is a prototype. So now, obviously, when you start doing these things with humans, you can't stick electrodes inside the brain. So you put EEG probes, electroencephalogram probes, on the skull itself, so that you can record some level of activity of averaged activity of neurons in the brain, and then you can train the neural networks in order to perform this task, right? So here is old style things people used to do with paraplegics, right? People who've had spinal cord damage or some neurodegenerative disorder that creates this locomotive motion disabilities, inability to walk, and so on. So for these patients, they used to do this kind of a training, right? So they would suspend the patient using this suspension apparatus on a treadmill, and they would have this mechanical device that would simulate movements of legs, right? This is just in order to keep the muscles moving, and then sort of trying to rebuild the connections from the sensory system to the brain and back from brain to the motor system, so that they're trying to recover some functionality, right? And then once you've done that for sufficient amount of time, you simply support the patient with that body weight support system, and then ask the patient to walk around on the ground, um, uh, and therefore try to recover some movement functionality. So this was the classic way in which people were doing this thing. Now, with uh, uh, they added this haptic feedback, somatosensory feedback, as well as uh, recorded the EEGs. So they're trying to see, can we decode these signals when the human is trying to make these kinds of movements, and then create simulation of movement, right? Uh, and give a feedback. So the human is now solving a virtual navigation task. So at least as of 2022, they were only solving virtual navigation tasks. But if you can solve the task in virtual navigation kind of scenario, you can imagine now you can have uh, augmented limbs attached to that same human being that can be controlled by the activity that you record on these EEG probes and get the human to actually perform that movement task that the human is no longer able to perform in the real world. Right? So this is where that kind of development, somatosensory motor kind of development is going. All right. So now let's look at some completely out of the box kind of an application of this somatosensory system. So before we do that, we need to look at how the somatosensory information is represented in the brain, in the cortex, right? So if you take a cross section literally in the middle of the brain over here, all right, this is the coronal section. If I take a slice going down the head like that, this is what the cortex in the brain looks like. And this is the somatosensory cortex. This is a part of the brain that responds to touch on your skin, right? So if you look at that, you see an interesting organization, right? Genitals, feet, toes are represented in this particular part of the cortex. Then you have the leg and the hip joint represented in this part of the cortex. Trunk, neck, head, shoulder, arm are represented here. Then you get elbow, forearm, and wrist represented in this part. And then hand has the palm of the hand has its own representation area. And then each individual finger gets part of the brain, right? So now you can start saying that these little fingers now have area almost equivalent in the cortex to the whole lot of your body, right? And that's just the fingers being represented. Uh, then your face also has much larger representation. Your eye has representation, your nose and face like mouth, teeth, gums, jaw, tongue, uh, and so on, right? Uh, so pharynx here has its own representation area. So now if you were to deform and change the sizes of different body parts to match the sizes of the parts of the cortex that represent them, this is what it would look like. So this is your somatosensory homunculus. This is what the man appears to be to your somatosensory cortex. Your fingers get high representation, therefore your fingers and palm are shown as being big, right? Your face and especially your lip and mouth areas get huge representation, so therefore it's shown as big, whereas the much of your body gets shrunk down to a smaller part of the cortex. So if your body was of the size proportional to the part that got represented in the brain, this is what you would look like: a tiny little human being with a huge mouth and huge hands, right? So you have disproportionate representation of these cortical areas. So now we are ready for a visual processes application. You remember when we were talking about visual processes in uh, using the visual system, we were talking about invasive applications, right? Stick in an array of electrodes onto the retina, stick in an array of electrodes onto the optic nerve, stick an array of electrodes onto the somatosensory cortex at the back of your head, and then stimulate different points, different electrodes in order to create percept of vision, right? But now, can you imagine if you were to simply take this video signal that is coming in, you can pass it on to the fingertips, right? Fingertips have high resolution because of high cortical representation that they have, as well as high density of sensors. Or you can do it on your tongue. Your tongue has a lot of somatosensory receptors, as well as it has uh, 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 taste receptors, right? So if you were to do electrical stimulation of multiple points on this, you can simulate shapes on your tongue, right? So shapes on your tongue can be used uh, for displaying visual information onto your tongue. So similar to the other system that you were looking at, there is a camera uh, that takes in incoming information. Incoming information now gets processed onto a big device that processes visual information, creates whatever representations that need to be electrically stimulated. But now, instead of electrically stimulating parts of the brain or the eye that actually create visual representation, you stimulate regions that create somatosensory representation. So, for example, your tongue, right? So now this is a very non-invasive kind of a thing, right? You can just have an electrode pad that just gets placed on top of the tongue. It can sit in your mouth, and then visual stimuli can get displayed onto the tongue. So technically, you're not using your visual system any longer. You're using your somatosensory system or your gustatory taste system, or in reality, actually the combination of the two, to create perception of a shape. So you can use that to solve visual navigation or visual object recognition kind of task. The advantage that this has is, one, we saw that this is non-invasive, right? You don't need to drill holes in the skull or cut open an eye to stick in electrode. So you don't have to worry about a whole lot of pain and suffering, as well as immune reaction kind of problems, right? You can simply place electrode stimulating pad on the tongue and you're done. The other advantage is, no matter what is causing your visual problem, you can create this visual processes as long as your somatosensory system is functional, right? So you don't have to worry about, oh, I got hit on the back of my head and now my primary visual cortex is damaged. So it doesn't matter whether you provide electrical stimulation in the retina, no information is getting processed as a visual information. Guess what? You still have functional tongue and somatosensory system that receives information from the tongue. You can stick in that electrode pad onto the tongue and you can get this to it. So obviously now you're limited by the capability resolution of the receptors in your tongue, as well as processing capabilities of your auditory system to process that kind of of your somatosensory system to process that kind of information, but information that your visual system is bringing in. Okay. Okay, so now let's look at olfactory system. Uh, uh, Organisms use odors to navigate. So here, for example, is a moth using odor plumes, right? So this is where the female moth is. It's secreting pheromones, and those pheromones are creating pheromone plumes, and the male uh, 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 moth uh, does a typical motion called casting. It moves from side to side in order to figure out where is the highest density of the odor and navigates towards the source of the odor. It can localize very accurately. Uh, Here is an example of a rat that is tracking chocolate. There is a line being drawn over here just for us to see visually that what olfactory stimulus the rat is tracking, but in reality, when the experiment is done, there is only the odor trace that is marked, chocolate smell that is marked on this paper, and the printer just keeps moving that dot matrix printer keeps moving that paper, and the rat keeps navigating back and forth to track. So you see that it doesn't perfectly follow, but it moves its head side to side along the odor track in order to trace uh, the odor perfectly in order to get a reward. Right? So we can solve these tasks very accurately. Even humans can solve these tasks very well. So for solving these tasks, you need the olfactory system, right? So here are the olfactory receptor neurons that sit inside your nose. Um, here over here, and these olfactory receptor neurons have the cilia floating into your mucus, nasal cavity mucus, right? And though within that these cilia now you have olfactory receptor proteins that bind to different odors and respond to that by channel opening and calcium influx and all those kinds of processes, metabolic processes that we were, second messenger processes that we were talking about, right? That are involved in signaling. So when that happens, you generate a receptor potential in the cilia that leads to, if it crosses a threshold at the soma, leads to generation of action potentials, and these action potentials will now travel up the olfactory nerve to go get to the brain, right? So to the olfactory bulb, and then from there on to the piriform cortex and so on. There are 350 different olfactory receptor protein genes in humans that encode different kinds of sensors, and these different sensors bind different odors with different efficiencies. With rodents, you have over 1,000 receptors. Each of these receptors projects onto one particular part of the olfactory bulb called the glomerulus. So one single olfactory receptor protein is expressed in a whole bunch of different olfactory receptor neurons, but all their inputs converge onto a very small region of the olfactory bulb called the glomerulus, which sends information to a small number of neurons in the olfactory bulb. So there is a mapping of odors onto uh, different regions of your olfactory bulb, right? So different olfactory receptor genes are expressed in different olfactory receptor neurons, and those project onto different glomeruli. So therefore, different parts of the olfactory bulb is getting very different information about different odors, right? So you can use that information to distinguish between odors. You can make an artificial nose now with similar kind of principles, right? You have electronic sensor array uh, that uh, can sense different odors. We'll see what different sensors are uh, sensors are possible. Once you have that information can pass on to some preprocessor that creates these different patterns of activity in response to different electronic sensor array sensors getting activated. And then you can do pattern recognition and saying that this particular configuration of sensors being active corresponds to this particular odor being presented, and therefore you have decoded the odor, right? So here is, for example, an array of different optical fibers which have been coated with fluorescent molecules that change their configuration and change their fluorescence in response to odor molecules binding, right? So you can see there are hundreds of these fibers with different uh, 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 responsive molecules coated onto them, and you can look at just the pattern of activation of these fibers in order to figure out which odor was being presented. You can have, so that those were the optical sensors that we were talking about, right? They can change fluorescence or absorbance. You can also have electrical signals that can change resistance or voltage. And you can have this by using conductive polymers or metal oxides that change their conductance or resistance or voltage that they produce uh, when they bind different odor molecules. You can also have gravimetric sensors, right? Piezoelectric crystals or microcantilevers that change their resonant frequencies in response to binding by odors. And then once that sensor information comes in, you pass it to a processor, and then you recognize the patterns. Right? So now, when you start talking about this, you can say, oh yeah, these are kind of vaguely parallel to what's happening in the real system, right? Olfactory receptor neuron is receiving smell information, passing it on to olfactory bulb, and then that is creating patterns of activity in the olfactory bulb that get recognized by olfactory cortex to know which smell is being sensed, right? So similar processing is happening here. But now you have to remember that your electronic sensors are not really as sensitive as your olfactory receptors are. You can literally sense one single molecule, right? That kind of resolution is not there. You have to have odors at very high concentration. So you're limited by the sensors over here. So obviously, people ask the question: if you're limited by the sensors, why not use uh, these very sensors, right? So you can either have olfactory receptor neurons being put in a petri dish, or you can have bacterial cells or yeast cells in which you've expressed these olfactory receptor proteins, right? And the second messenger cascade, such that when the odor binds the olfactory receptor protein, it leads to calcium influx, and that calcium influx can be imaged using calcium sensitive dyes. So now you've created a system in which you have olfactory receptors that send in information to your artificial nose system, right? And then you can process this information um, uh, in order to create a representation of odors in your brain, in your artificial system, sorry, in order to recognize, right? Uh, uh, so this image shows all these three processes in parallel, right? It shows normal human nose. It shows how electronic noses used to be used. Now you have this cyborg kind of a thing, wherein you have olfactory receptors that interface with the rest of the components of electronic nose. So you are providing higher sensitivity to your artificial nose system, right? And you can imagine all kinds of applications, right? Has this food gone bad? Does this food have the right kind of odor that will entice a human being to come and pay for this food? Um, uh, Detect if there is something rotting, right? Where is something rotting? Often you have rat dies and then your home smells and you can't find, you have to go hunting around, right? You can teach a robot to do that hunting with this artificial nose instead of suffering that yourself. You can also use this for solving more dangerous problems, right? For example, humans have these terrible habits of going to wars, and when they go to wars, they come up with all kinds of destructive ways of harming each other, right? So one way they do that is by laying landmines. And then war is over, but landmines are all over the place, and somebody loses the map of where the landmines are. So now they are like in the war zones. Now there are landmines sitting from the First World War, and every now and then some human being walks across that field full of landmines and ends up dying, right? So you need to keep uh, identifying where the landmines are, disabling them, and taking them out. You can use these artificial nose systems, but still there are limitations, right? So what people have been doing so far is using trained animals. Here you have trained rats, people have used trained monkeys, trained dogs, and so on to find out where the mines are, right? People have also used these animals for other purposes, right? So, for example, detecting when a patient has tuberculosis. Uh, this is a cheap system. You don't need complex biochemistry or molecular biology analysis tools to analyze samples. So you can do it on cheap uh, in parts of the world where these kinds of facilities may not be available, rural India, sub-Saharan Africa, and so on, right? Uh, you just need humans that train these animals to do this detection, and then trained animals can go anywhere and do these detection. Um, uh, for tuberculosis, people have tried using this. People have tried using this for cancers and so on. These systems work fairly well in diagnosis. They're getting closer to being applicable, but there are certain limitations, right? For example, limitations on number of humans available to train these animals. These animals end up dying, so you need to constantly keep training them, more and more animals to perform these tasks. Then variability comes in, and all those kinds of problems start arising, right? So then I'm proposing this thing of why not create artificial agents that can train these animals automatically in large numbers. Remember, these animals bring in sensitivity, accuracy, and cheap applications, right? And then you can have a simple uh, uh, detector, right? You can replace a human that also has to be trained to say that look at the animal's actions and say that yeah, this behavior of the animal corresponds to animal having detected this cancer versus not having. So if you have an artificial agent now, you can uh, find landmines and diffuse them. You can find tuberculosis and send the patient to for treatment. You can find cancers, again send them for treatment, and so on. So you can have various sensory modalities, various motor actions, and all those kinds of things that can interface with these artificial systems in order to solve all kinds of real world engineering problems that we need to solve. Okay? Um, so now let's move on to the next system, which is your auditory system, right? And you know, there are a lot of people that have auditory deficits, right? Deaf people that need help navigating real world, right? If you can't hear a loud honking from behind, you are in danger of being hit by a stupid motorcyclist who's trying to uh, have some sort of a motorcycle race in the middle of a crowded street, right? Uh, so you need to have auditory processes. For some kind of patients, when you simply have degradation, age-related degradation, hearing aid that simply amplifies sound is sufficient. But for many patients, that's not possible. You have damage to your ears, and your auditory apparatus is incapable of passing on the auditory information in there. Uh, uh, so you need to fix those systems, right? So so you have to create auditory processes. But before we create auditory processes, let's talk about the how the auditory information is passed through the ear, right? You have your tympanic membrane in the inner ear. So your outer ear kind of helps focus the sound inside. In the inner ear, you have tympanic membrane, literally a flexible membrane that resonates with the sound that comes in. That is connected through ossicles, these three bones, to the uh, uh, to this auditory system, the cochlea, right? Here you have the snail-like spiraling organ, and you have this little piston, a bone that literally pushes inside that thing to cause pressure changes. So we'll see how that. So my presentation hung up on the previous slide, so I'm going to continue from this slide again instead of shooting the entire video. So your cochlear system, as I said, cochlea is the snail-like organ, right? So now the snail has been cut to reveal that uh, it's not just a single canal that runs across. There are three chambers, three canals that are sort of running in parallel to each other. uh, this ossicle here, the bone that, like you remember, there were three bones connected to the tympanic membrane, right? And as the tympanic membrane moved, these three bones moved, and then finally this bone called the stapes moves in, and as it moves into the canal, you're changing pressure, right? So you're literally operating a hydraulic system and changing pressure inside this. Uh, so pressure changes here, goes through the entire spiral, and these all these three are finally connected to each other such that the pressure change is felt here as well. In between these two canals, there is a third canal, the scala media, which has the hair cells that respond to the auditory stimuli. And the way they respond is as pressure changes, they get moved around and they respond to the movement, right? Now, the pressure change itself is happening in a graded manner. Pressure changes in a graded manner. So now you see that that entire spiral that we were looking at earlier of your cochlea has been simply opened up, right? So so if this this was the spiral over here, this has just been opened up to stretch it out. So this is the entirety of the spiral of the cochlea that has been opened up. Remember that this bone is moving in and out, causing pressure changes, right? As that pressure changes, the membrane between these canals is moving because of the pressure. As that movement, you cause resonance. Now, the membrane thickness is not uniform throughout. The membrane thickness is variable such that different parts of the membrane have different resonant frequencies, such that the very farthest end from this moving bone, the very farthest end responds to lowest frequency. So here, for example, 100 hertz sound input coming in stimulates this particular part of the membrane. 1000 hertz stimulates this middle part of the membrane, and 10,000 hertz stimulates this other part of the membrane. So therefore, when you play these different sounds, very different parts of these membranes are going to respond. If you play complex sounds, so for example, when I'm speaking, it's not just one single pure tone that is being emitted. Variety of different frequencies are being emitted simultaneously. So when that happens, different parts of this resonant membrane are going to resonate, and therefore the hair cells in these different parts are going to receive strong stimulation, while hair cells in these other parts are not going to receive strong stimulation. So therefore now this auditory information is going to get passed on from your cochlea onto the higher information processing regions in your nervous system. And these pieces of information are now going to be frequency dependent. Different uh, uh, hair cells are going to pass on information about different frequencies to the auditory nerve, and different parts of the auditory nerve are therefore going to carry information about sounds at different frequencies going in. So now we are finally ready to solve the auditory deficits, right? Let's assume that there was a damage to tympanic membrane, or the patient was born without these three ossicles, the three bones that move when your tympanic membrane moves, right? But your cochlea are perfectly intact. So then in that case, you can put uh, a linear array of stimulating electrodes in the cochlea, right? Uh, uh, and uh, and electrically stimulate them in response to sound. So you can simply have a microphone that records sounds as they're coming in, and then you pass it through a processing device that can segregate different frequencies and measure the power at different frequencies, and depending on power at different frequencies, it can stimulate. Let's say, for example, if you want to give low frequency if you get low frequency auditory stimulus, that can trigger uh, 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 this thing in this part of the cochlea. If you have higher frequency or auditory stimulus, you stimulate this particular part of the cochlea, and so on. So you can have very different uh, perception of very different frequencies depending on which part uh, are you electrically stimulating. Uh, Now you have another problem, right? What happens if your cochlea are damaged? What are you going to do, right? Just like we were talking about visual system, you can directly stimulate the auditory cortex. Now, the primary auditory cortex is very conveniently organized such that lower frequencies stimulate one particular part of the primary auditory cortex, and higher frequencies stimulate different parts. So you can simply put electrical stimulating electrodes onto the cortex, and therefore stimulate different parts of the cortex and generate sensation of different auditory frequencies. So you can do auditory processes using this kind of pattern. All right, so now we are ready to move from individual sensory modalities to multimodal integration. So we're going to watch a video now that talks about what happens when visual information and auditory information are coming together, right? Uh, so let's watch the video.
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba.
Have a look at this. What do you hear?
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba.
But look what happens when we change the picture.
Ba, ba, ba. Ba, ba, ba. Ba.
And yet, the sound hasn't changed. In every clip, you are only ever hearing ba with a B.
Ba, ba. Ba,
It's an illusion known as the McGurk effect.
ba,
Take another look.
ba,
Concentrate first on the right of the screen.
ba,
Now to the left of the screen.
ba.
The illusion occurs because what you are seeing clashes with what you are hearing.
In the illusion, what we see overrides what we hear. So the mouth movements we see as we look at a face can actually influence what we believe we're hearing. If we close our eyes, we actually hear the sound as it is. If we open our eyes, we actually see how the mouth movements can influence what we're hearing. Ba, ba, ba.
It's a bizarre effect. Remember, the only sound you're hearing is ba with a B.
Ba, 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 ba.
What's remarkable about this illusion is even knowing how it's done doesn't seem to make a difference.
Ba. The effect works no matter how much you know about the effect. I've been studying the McGurk effect for 25 years now, and I've been the face in the stimuli. I've seen stimuli thousands of times, but the effect still works on me. I can't help it. Ba, 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 ba.
The McGurk experiment shows us that even when our senses are working normally, we can still make mistakes in interpreting their signals.
All right, so this McGurk effect is again a very nice example of difference between perception and sensation that we were talking about, right? You remember when we were looking at the visual system, we talked about how visual perception is affected by context, affected by expectation of what you should be seeing, and so on, right? So now in this example, we are actually using two sensory modalities. The dominant visual sensory modality is setting the expectation of what you should be hearing, and the auditory modality, that that the sensation is actually being completely overridden by uh, the the visual system, and therefore you actually hear a sound that is not even being produced in the video. Um, so 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 this kind of nicely rounds up what we have spoken so far, because this brings us to the understanding that information, yeah, from different sensory modalities is not processed by your brain independently of each other. It's put together, right? And when it's put together, these sensory modalities end up affecting each other. And as these sensory modalities affect each other, they can create this complex perception of everything, right? When you see me talk, uh, you can clearly see my mouth move and you can hear me, and these things are correlated. Very often, if there is a variable delay between mouth movement and the sound that you hear, it gets very distracting because things are not matched, right? That's happening because your brain is constantly processing these stimuli together. Obviously, when it comes to higher order systems, cognitive processes, you are putting together information from all these different kinds of inputs to create representations. So from the next slide, we're going to start looking at an example of that through the spatial navigation system. All right, so we are ready to start looking at the cognitive systems. And as I said, we are going to use spatial navigation as an example. So here was the first experiment where involvement of hippocampus in spatial navigation was demonstrated. So O'Keefe and Ostrowski were recording from individual neurons in the hippocampus uh, of a rat that was moving around. So there were a lot of things. There was a curtain around, there was a fan over here, there were recording apparatus sitting here, and so on. And what they noticed is that as the animal moved around, this particular neuron fired a lot of action potentials when the animal was at this location, but not so much when the animal was at all these other locations, right? So every time the animal is here, the neuron fires a lot. When the animal is here, the neuron fires a little. When the animal is in all these other places, the neuron doesn't fire much, right? So these were called the place cells, neurons that represent specific locations in the environment, right? So if you record simultaneously from a large number of these place cells, you'll have different place cells firing at different locations in the environment, creating this map of your space, right? And these spatial representations are not simply representations of sensory stimuli that you encounter at different locations. These are representations of this abstract notion of here is where I am. Okay, uh, so uh, so your spatial navigation system creates these representations. So this is the hippocampal place cell that we were talking about a movement ago. How do you create this representation of space? The hippocampus gets inputs from the lateral and the medial entorhinal cortex, and these are higher order processing regions. Remember, all the sensory information has already got in, processed, multisensory integration has already happened, and now this information is coming in to these regions, right? So the medial entorhinal cortex receives information from motion sensitive regions. You remember visual information was segregating into a what pathway and a where pathway, right? Where pathway went dorsally over here to area empty, whereas where what pathway went to inferior temporal lobe down here, right? So that information is coming in segregated through the medial entorhinal cortex. You are receiving information about your movement, right? So path integration derived information. How fast did you move? Which direction were you moving in? If you keep track of it constantly and you integrate that, you know your displacement, and therefore with respect to your starting point, you know exactly where you are. You can contradict that, contrast that against the what information that comes in via the lateral entorhinal cortex, right? You can distinguish between different objects. Let's say, for example, these neurons that are firing at different objects, uh, uh, the white circles are objects, and the firing rates of neurons are high near these objects, right? So you can distinguish between these objects. You're looking at the activities of these neurons. And in this region, you also get object-dependent representation of space. Neurons fire at locations away from objects only when these objects are present in the environment. So you can create this representation of space in the lateral entorhinal cortex, right? So now these two forms of information, uh, uh, path integration derived spatial information from the medial internal cortex, and object derived non-spatial as well as spatial information from the lateral internal cortex is converging together onto the hippocampus and enabling hippocampus to create a representation of space. But it does much more than simply create a representation of space. So for example, this particular figure over here is representing memory of object locations. So there have been multiple sessions before this particular session in which this one particular object was placed at these three locations, and then in this fourth session the object has been completely taken out from the environment. And yet this neuron fires at all three locations where the object used to be in the previous session. So this neuron represents the memory of object having been there in those locations, right? So it's conjunctive representation of space, where, as well as what, right? This particular object was at these three locations. So where and what information is being combined in order to create memory of location of objects in the hippocampus. Here is a landmark vector representation, a single neuron that fires at multiple locations that can be defined as a function of distance and directions from multiple objects, right? This information can now be used for navigating, right? How far am I from this particular landmark? That information can feed into your spatial navigation system in order to figure out where are you, right? So this information now can be used to navigate through real world, right? So obviously we are now going to look at uh, an engineering application of this problem, right? So people have made robots that navigate, drones that navigate, and so on. But with all these systems, the common problem is errors keep accumulating, right? As you do more and more actions, the errors just keep accumulating. And that's happening because there are errors in your path integration system. They just keep adding on and on and on. So now you can create a biologically inspired robotic navigation system that combine landmark-based navigation as well as path integration-based navigation. So these are simulating these phenomena that you observe in normal thing, and then we are using this landmark-based information to reset this path integration-based information that is happening in the brain and in your artificial navigating unit, and you're getting this world graph or map to define your action, uh, and then finishing the feedback with affordances. Here is where I'm going to get a reward, and therefore am I improving my path and so on. That also influences the action, and therefore you finally end up getting motor outputs, right? So now these systems, depending on the specific configuration that you're using, perform better and better, such that certain systems can perform actually much better when they incorporate this kind of architecture where your landmark based navigation and path integration based navigation are complementing each other in order to solve this navigation problem. So this was the last slide. We've covered in these 4 lectures. We've looked at how neurons process information, how the nervous system is similar and different from uh, the the computer and artificial navigation systems, and so on. Then we have looked at specific examples of somatosensory system, different sensory systems, sorry, as well as motor system and the a higher order cognitive system of spatial navigation. And we've seen how in each of these situations you can create artificial systems that can augment perception of real human beings, and therefore solve problems, deficits in humans that have had congenital deficits, injuries, and so on. In contrast, we've also seen how your robotics or artificial intelligence kind of applications can be better solved using our understanding of how real brains work. Uh, Hopefully, this has been both informative as well as entertaining to you, and I look forward to seeing your engineering contributions to both our understanding of the brain, as well as augmenting the brain, as well as using how the brain works uh, to better design and engineer complex systems to solve real world problems. Thank you very much, and bye bye.